Coming up on the program, what happens when your heart skips its own beat? We dive into atrial fibrillation. What is it, why it matters, and how it's managed? Then, a promising new trial brings hope for a puzzling brain condition that causes trouble walking, thinking, and controlling your bladder. And Billy Joel was recently diagnosed with it.
Support for What's Health Got to Do with It is provided in part by the American Brain Foundation invests in research across the spectrum of the brain, knowing all brain diseases, disorders, and injuries are connected. There can be no cures without research. Learn how you can make a difference today at AmericanBrainFoundation.org. Rethreaded knows human trafficking destroys lives, but they also know it's not the end of the story. Rethreaded believes in the potential and power of all survivors to reclaim their lives. Visit rethreaded.com to learn more. And Elevate Med. Through mentorship, leadership development, financial literacy, a robust peer network, and tuition-based scholarship support, Elevate Med is dedicated to the next generation of diverse physician leaders as a tangible step towards the eradication of health disparities. More at elevatemed.org.
From the moment we're born to our last breath, every American embarks on a journey through the intricate maze of the healthcare system. These are their stories, one life at a time. Today we meet Jason. Jason is a 39-year-old graphic designer who ran weekend 5Ks, considers himself healthy, until he collapsed at work, struggling to speak and move his right side. At the ER, doctors confirmed a stroke. But the real shock came later. What silent condition increased his stroke risk 5-fold? Hi, I'm Dr. Joe Sirven, a practicing neurologist at Mayo Clinic, professor of healthcare administration and policy at Arizona State University. And this is What's Health Got to Do with It, which looks at where and how healthcare intersects with your life, helping you get the medical answers you want. Now let's turn our attention back to Jason. The diagnosis is undiagnosed atrial fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat that had gone unnoticed for years and led to his stroke. Strokes are no longer just a disease of old age. Rates are rising in younger adults. And one of the most under-recognized contributors is atrial fibrillation, a condition that can be silent but deadly. Joining us now is Dr. Samuel Oza. He is director of the Atrial Fibrillation Institute at Ascension St. Vincent's Hospital here in Jacksonville. And he's going to talk to us about early detection, lifestyle changes, and what makes the atrial fibrillation-related strokes both dangerous and yet preventable. Dr. Oza, welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me on the show.
It's so good to have you here. We opened with Jason's story. He's far from alone. It's sadly much more common than I think people would realize. But let's start, before we get into his case, let's kind of start with an even set for our listeners. As easy as you can, avoiding as much medical speak as you possibly can. What is atrial fibrillation?
So atrial fibrillation is actually the most common arrhythmia in human beings. So it's something that is quite prevalent in the United States. We think in the next 20 to 30 years, there'll be nearly 40 million people with atrial fibrillation. So it's going to be a very common disease. It occurs when the heart, instead of beating the normal 60 to 100 times a minute, which happens when you're asleep or awake doing normal things, the top chamber, or the atria of the heart, begins to fibrillate or beat 300 to 400 times a minute. So instead of contracting or squeezing, it just starts to quiver. And that comes with all the symptoms that people feel with atrial fibrillation, their heart palpitating, or a feeling that a fish is kind of flopping around in your chest,
right.
Shortness of breath, dizziness sometimes, or just sometimes vague sensations of fatigue. Young, healthy people like Jason sometimes don't even know they have it until they have something terrible like a stroke.
Why does this type of rhythm pose such a serious risk when it's not diagnosed?
So, again, the worst thing in atrial fibrillation, or one of the worst things that can happen, is stroke. And that occurs because in simple terms, the blood really doesn't move around in the heart as well as it should when the heart is quivering rather than squeezing. If you don't feel anything, then the first symptom you may get is a stroke. And in Jason's case, that's what happened, is that we didn't know anything about it. We see in the hospital all the time that people come in with a stroke and, they had no idea they had atrial fibrillation. That happens to be their first symptom of atrial fibrillation.
Is this unusual we'll take Jason's case. He's a younger person versus someone that's older. Can you talk about age and how that fits into this atrial fibrillation story?
So just like many cardiovascular diseases, it increases in prevalence. It increases with age. And that's just because of your cumulative lifestyle, the cumulative damage your body goes through because of the things we inflict upon it, right? So if your diet isn't as good as it should be, if you're not exercising, if you have a lot of stress throughout your life, over the course of time, that increases your risk not just for atrial fibrillation, but for all the other diseases that go along that are risk factors for atrial fibrillation. High blood pressure, diabetes, coronary artery diseases, or blockage in the arteries that supply your heart, stroke, all these things kind of run together because they occur when we don't treat our bodies as well as we should have throughout our lives. So as we get older, that risk increases. Jason's case is a little unique. He's 39 years old. You mentioned he's a runner. Do you know if he runs a lot?
I don't know those details.
So I see a lot of patients in my clinic that are cyclists, marathon runners, triathletes. So it's almost like a bell curve in which if you don't exercise enough, you get a significant risk for atrial fibrillation. And then as you exercise more and are more active, that risk goes down up to a certain point. And then if you are an endurance athlete that exercises excessively, meaning, there's cyclists out there that ride 120 miles at a strip and in a session, and they do that 3-4 times a week. That's excessive exercise in normal people's minds. Obviously, in their minds, it's normal, exactly what they want to be doing.
Right.
But in those sorts of athletes, in those sports that I mentioned, they can do that for a long period of time throughout their lives, and that puts a lot of strain on the heart. And those people actually have a higher risk for atrial fibrillation. They have a higher risk for stroke, and they have a higher risk for cardiac arrest. So there is a kind of sweet spot for the vast majority of people. That's not an excuse not to exercise, because you can exercise quite a bit in normal, everyday people, and you're actually improving your risk for not having atrial fibrillation. It's really those high intensity endurance athletes that have that problem. The other thing is genetics. So genetics certainly plays a component in atrial fibrillation. There are rare conditions, there are rare genes that are familial, which means it's inherited by family members. That's probably 1% or less of people that have atrial fibrillation have those genes, and that can happen at very young ages. They don't have those comorbid or associated conditions like coronary disease, diabetes, hypertension. They don't have those. It's called lone atrial fibrillation that can be caused by the genetics of that patient. Now, there's also more common genetics that you see somebody that looks pretty healthy, that they're doing a lot of the things they should be, they get atrial fibrillation. They have genes that predispose them to atrial fibrillation.
I see. Okay.
But it doesn't mean that anybody else in their family might have it. It's just their particular risk, and that also plays a role in whether or not somebody develops atrial fibrillation.
Let me point out, one of the interesting things about Jason's story was the fact that the atrial fibrillation, and you alluded to this already, was diagnosed as a result of the thing we're trying to kind of prevent from happening to begin with. So I guess the question is, how can someone be living with it and not know, if you will?
So we don't know the exact reason why some people feel their atrial fibrillation and some don't. In general, in my experience, in my practice, people that are younger and more active tend to feel every little thing in their body. If they have a little pain, they notice it. Yeah. And as we get older, we have more pains and more aches, and you kind of chalk things up to getting older. So young people tend to feel their atrial fibrillation a little bit more. Jason may just maybe, in people like that, if they have intermittent atrial fibrillation, it's called paroxysmal atrial fibrillation when it comes and goes.
Okay.
Sometimes they get it only when they exercise. So maybe he would have noticed it when he was running, and he's like, oh, maybe I'm just losing a step here and not able to, run quite as fast as he normally does. And that might be his kind of equivalent of symptoms that he just didn't recognize.
So I guess that brings us to the question let's say someone's listening out there and they may have the question in their mind, what is it that they should be looking for? Like, is there some list of things that if they feel it, I should be checking this out?
So years ago, we were at a meeting of specialists like myself, and one of the things that some of our colleagues in England had discussed is they ran a campaign where medical students went out into the community and taught people how to feel their pulse. It was a Know Your Pulse campaign, and they've done that in certain communities here in the United States as well. But learning to feel your pulse and what a normal pulse should feel like is probably the best weapon against undiagnosed atrial fibrillation, because again, if you don't have any symptoms, how are you going to know? You can go to your doctor, but that's going to be once every 6 months or once a year if you're younger. If you learn how to feel your pulse, it takes literally 5 seconds in the morning when you wake up to feel your pulse. So if you have atrial fibrillation, you'll learn what your normal pulse feels like, and then you'll recognize an irregular pulse, because that's really how it shows up in your body, and you can tell is your pulse isn't steady like a clock. It becomes much more erratic and irregular, so you can't predict the next beat.
I know you've just mentioned public education campaigns around AFib. For some reason, when I think of that, I think of something that's not necessarily public education, but I keep thinking of the Apple Watch commercial where they would put the watch on and they talk about picking up this rhythm on the watch. And I guess outside of that, because those aren't cheap, what kind of screening tools are available? Is it as simple as what you just said, checking the pulse, or talk about the screening tools?
Sure, yeah. So the most trusted screening tool we use in the clinic is called an EKG, electrocardiogram. Okay. So that's the most definitive diagnosis. If you have AFib on an electrocardiogram, then you know the diagnosis definitively. There are other things that mimic atrial fibrillation, and pretty much all the other screening tools. If you have extra beats that can occur in healthy people that don't have atrial fibrillation, they're not quite as exacting as an EKG, but they're good enough. So a blood pressure cuff, usually simple blood pressure cuffs, when people buy them from the convenience store, from their pharmacy, those usually are able to tell you whether or not you have an irregular heartbeat. It may not necessarily be atrial fibrillation that it alerts you to, but if you have a cuff like that shows that your heartbeat is irregular, you do want to talk to your doctor about it and say, okay, I'm getting this reading on my blood pressure cuff. I want to do further testing, and the doctor will recommend what kind of testing that would be. So that's one thing. There's several other things besides an Apple Watch. There's something called a cardia monitor that we use quite a bit. That was one of the first ones, KARDIA.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a little flat metal plate. And there's other brands now out, but you basically put 2 fingers on it, and you're able to get an EKG just on your phone. So it's pretty neat. There's a lot of really, and you mentioned Apple Watch. It's unbelievable how many patients come to us now with their own EKGs from an Apple Watch, showing me that they have atrial fibrillation, and that's their diagnosis. So
amazing.
We don't have to rely on these professional monitors anymore every time. We use Holter monitors, which are monitors that you put on your chest as a patch to wear and record an EKG over the course of days. These watches people can wear every day of their lives pretty much, and it can pick up these rhythms. So it's going to do a lot to really transform the way we catch these rhythms and the monitoring of these rhythms.
To all of our listeners out there, you're listening to What's Health Got to Do with It on WJCT News 89.9. I'm Dr. Joe Sirven. If you're just joining us, we are in conversation with cardiologist Dr. Oza about heart rhythms, atrial fibrillation to be exact, that can lead to stroke. And we want to hear from you. Tag us on social media at @JServin. So let's go to talk a little bit about prevention. You talked about how exercise is huge, but how do other lifestyle factors, it's what is in every wellness video, sleep, alcohol, diet, stress, play a role in the management of atrial fibrillation?
So there are several studies out now that show that if you're obese, if you can lose weight, if you're overweight and you can lose weight, you can actually reduce your incidence of atrial fibrillation. So when you do studies that look at how much atrial fibrillation people have, it's really been shown that reducing your weight can improve that. Managing all your comorbid conditions, the conditions that occur with atrial fibrillation, that are risk factors for atrial fibrillation, can also reduce that risk. So if you have high blood pressure, making sure you have a blood pressure cuff, that your blood pressure is reliably reduced with any medications we're taking, is extremely important. Diabetes is the same way. You want to keep your blood sugar levels within range. You don't want to see those spike up high a lot, because that also is an uncontrolled diabetes will increase your risk for atrial fibrillation. So those are all things. And like I said, it's all a web of interrelated conditions. Like one thing causes another. So atrial fibrillation just plays into that web of diseases that, diet, lifestyle, exercising, making sure that you're, reducing your stress levels. Meditation has been shown to improve symptoms of atrial fibrillation. So there are so many things that if you start doing them, they'll help in all facets of disease prevention.
Let's say that you have a diagnosis. You find it that, let's say you have that watch. I'm still impressed with the number of people who are self-diagnosing and then showing up in your office. What do you do? What does management or treatment look like? I know we've been talking about prevention, but what does treatment look like?
So the first thing you want to do when somebody has any kind of irregular heart rhythm is to make sure that the heart is structurally sound. Make sure everything's pumping well. Make sure the valves are okay. Make sure that there's no other factors in your cardiac condition that could influence your heart rhythm. So first thing we do is getting an echocardiogram. That's one of the first things we look to screen for other problems. Then what we'll do is we want to see kind of how much atrial fibrillation you have, depending on if you're a normal rhythm when you come to see me or if you're in atrial fibrillation. Like I said, there's two types of atrial fibrillation. One is intermittent atrial fibrillation or paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. If you have atrial fibrillation more than 7 days, that lasts persistently more than 7 days, or you have to get shocked out of the rhythm with a cardioversion, which I'll explain in a second, it's considered persistent atrial fibrillation. And the workup for those are a little different. So if we know you have atrial fibrillation a lot, we really don't need to do any monitors or anything like that. So once we check and see that your heart's structurally sound, often we also want to see if you have any risk for blockages in the arteries surrounding the heart. So we'll get a stress test. And those are probably the two main things that we do before we move on with any further treatment. We make sure that there's no blockages that need to be fixed. If you need bypass surgery or something like that because there's severe coronary disease, that would be something we'd want to take care of before we address the atrial fibrillation. Once that's done, then we move on to treatment. I think there's many different reasons that we treat people in certain ways. If they're young, otherwise healthy, we want to treat them one way. If they're elderly with a lot of other conditions, we'll treat them in another way. So we can go through all the options of treatment. I think that would be a good next place to go. So you start with, doing nothing. So if somebody has one episode of atrial fibrillation and they came out of it on their own, we can just monitor that. We can see if they have more episodes, and depending on how symptomatic they are, depending on how concerned they are about it, we can just kind of watch them. If they have a certain number of risk factors for stroke, we would start them on medications called anticoagulants, or they're known as blood thinners.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the biggest kind of way we can prevent stroke. Those reduce the risk of stroke by about 65%, and if you take all the trials, so that really significantly reduces the incidence of stroke in atrial fibrillation. Now, unfortunately, it's not zero, so you can still have stroke even if you take blood thinners. Then we move on to how do we prevent the atrial fibrillation? How can we stop it from happening? Well, there's medications that can do that. They're called antiarrhythmic drugs. The antiarrhythmic drugs have benefit as well as risk. So the benefit is that you can just take a pill and it can reduce the amount of atrial fibrillation you have, and they work by changing kind of the milieu of ions in your heart cells. So it makes it more difficult for your heart to beat really rapidly, which is required in atrial fibrillation. So that atrium has to beat very quickly. These drugs reduce that risk. So you really reduce the chances of atrial fibrillation anywhere between 40 and 60% per year by taking these antiarrhythmic drugs. And they work great for some people. However, because of the risk, we've now developed other tools, more invasive tools like atrial fibrillation ablation. So in atrial fibrillation ablation, we move to a more interventional technique where we go in through a needle stick in the leg. So we go into a vein in the leg, kind of in the groin area, and the patient's asleep at this point. We thread catheters up to the heart. We actually eliminate tissue within the heart or within the left upper chamber called the left atrium that is responsible for atrial fibrillation. And with that treatment, depending on the stage of atrial fibrillation you have, if you have late stage atrial fibrillation versus early stage atrial fibrillation, you can get over 80 to 85% success rates at 1 year of eliminating that atrial fibrillation. So that's probably the most effective treatment we have, but it's an invasive therapy.
Sure. We don't want to get to that point. We have a listener question, and they wondered, what role does anxiety play in atrial fibrillation? Because so many people, like if they think it must be panic attack, but maybe it isn't. How do you address that particular question?
So if you can imagine, you're just sitting on the couch and your heart starts to race and thumping in your chest. Sometimes you get a little short of breath. You can get a little dizzy. That in itself is anxiety provoking. So, it can be a vicious cycle where the anxiety occurs because your heart starts beating fast. And then the anxiety actually makes it worse because when you're anxious, you get a catecholamine surge where your kind of adrenaline kicks in, and then that makes your heart beat even faster, making you more symptomatic and making the anxiety worse. So that's one way anxiety plays into it. The other way is that anxiety is a form of stress. So if you have chronic anxiety, stress can actually exacerbate or make AFib more common and occur more often. So that is something that needs to be treated if you have anxiety. And the third way is that anxiety can cause you to feel like you have palpitations. So it can cause your normal heart rate to go up, and it can cause your heart rate to beat harder. So it feels like your heart's thumping. So people that have anxiety disorder often think they have some kind of arrhythmia. So they think that something's wrong with their heart rhythm, where when we put a monitor on them, everything's completely fine when they have these anxiety attacks, and it's really their anxiety that's causing the symptoms themselves. So you have to kind of tease all that out, but they're all interrelated.
I know someone's listening out there, and maybe they relate to the story that we gave with Jason. Maybe as just speaking as a cardiologist, doctor, what's a small step that anyone listening out here, listening to the show about this, do to protect their heart, brain for that matter? What do you recommend as a cardiologist as the best preventative thing? Do this.
So that's an excellent question, because people that make whole scale changes in their lives, wholesale changes in their lives, they tend to not be able to follow through on that the rest of their lives. So any change you make, you want to be able to make sure, okay, can I do this for the rest of my life? Because there's no point in stopping in a year and going back to where you were, because cardiovascular disease is a long-term risk. It has to be chronically, you have to continually perform whatever intervention you're going to do. So what I tell people, if you're not exercising at all, just go out for a walk every day.
Okay.
Start with that. Start with something you can do every day. And then once you make it a habit, you want to make whatever you're doing a habit. It takes about 6 weeks to form a habit. So if you can do something for 6 weeks, generally that'll kind of imprint itself on your brain, and then you'll continue doing it. If you're going to make a dietary change, maybe just start with, okay, if you're eating a lot after dinner for that, late night snack,
Sure.
Just cut that out.
Okay.
So start with small things that you can just sustain and make that a habit, and then move on to the next thing.
I want to give you the opportunity now to address our listeners directly with any message you'd like to give about atrial fibrillation or heart health or any topic in health that you think people should know.
So I've been involved in this field, heart rhythm medicine, for about 20 years, and the treatments for atrial fibrillation during that time have changed dramatically. It used to be a condition that we'd say, okay, well, you have to kind of learn to deal with it. To now, nobody has to deal with atrial fibrillation. Like, we have ways to treat almost every stage of atrial fibrillation in almost every patient. I won't say every patient. There are people that are the exception. But the techniques that we have now with some of the medications, and certainly ablation. Ablation's gone from being a 4 to 6 hour procedure where you stay overnight in the hospital and really, it's a big deal, to now, I mean, the procedures have gotten dramatically shorter where people can leave the same day just after a few hours, go home, have normal lives, and then not have to deal with their atrial fibrillation. So really nobody should have to live with atrial fibrillation anymore. There's treatments out there. Certainly you want to make sure you protect yourself from stroke. So the anticoagulants and the blood thinners are also an important message to really, really make people understand how important that is when you have atrial fibrillation. But that really, you don't have to live with this. There are ways we can make you feel better if you're having atrial fibrillation.
I love that final message of hope. Dr. Oza, I want to thank you so much. I know you're a busy person, busy doctor. Thanks for coming in studio and joining us to talk about this hugely important topic.
Thank you so much for having me, Jay. It's my pleasure.
We've loved having you here. We've been talking to Dr. Samuel Oza. He is director of the Atrial Fibrillation Institute at Ascension St. Vincent's Hospital here in Jacksonville. Up next, after your health headlines, we'll explore the ultimate innovator, our brains, and the wonder that lie within. And we'll be right back. Hey, it's Dr. Joe Sirven. I have a new show called This Week in Health, and it's part of WJCT News Now. Local news you can listen to anytime, anywhere. When you sign up, you'll unlock 4 local podcasts delivered straight to your podcast app. I break down the week's biggest health headlines and what they mean for you. Start a free 30-day trial at wjct.org/newsnow. And if you like it, become a monthly donor to support WJCT Public Media.
Hi, I'm Stacey Bennett, producer of What's Health Got to Do With It, and these are your weekly health headlines. 21 people became ill after drinking raw milk from a Florida farm. The cases span across North and Central Florida and include serious infections like Campylobacter and Shiga toxin-producing E. coli. 7 people have been hospitalized with at least 2 suffering severe complications. Raw milk, which has not been pasteurized to kill bacteria, is legally sold in Florida for pet consumption only, yet it's still being consumed by people seeking its perceived health benefits. The Florida Department of Health stresses that poor sanitation practices on the farm likely contributed to the outbreak. Raw milk has been championed by some public figures, but the CDC and FDA continue to warn of the risks, especially to children and those with weakened immune systems. Pasteurization remains a critical tool in preventing foodborne illness. A deadly outbreak of Legionnaire's disease is spreading in Harlem, with 2 people now dead and 58 diagnosed since late July, according to New York City health officials. The illness is a severe form of pneumonia caused by Legionella bacteria. It's linked to contaminated water vapor from cooling systems and other water sources. The cluster spans 5 Harlem zip codes and nearby areas. Health officials are urging anyone with flu-like symptoms such as cough, fever, or shortness of breath who lives, works, or visited the area since July 25th to seek medical care immediately. Antibiotics can treat the disease, but early action is critical. Legionnaire's disease does not spread person to person. Those most at risk include adults over 50, smokers, and people with chronic illnesses or weakened immune systems. A viral TikTok trend called burn lines, or sunburn tattoos, is drawing urgent warnings from dermatologists and global health leaders. The trend encourages teens and young adults to stencil shapes on their skin and intentionally burn around them to create temporary tan line designs, but experts say the damage is anything but temporary. Health authorities warn that even a single severe sunburn can double the risk of skin cancer later in life. The trend causes irreversible skin and DNA damage, premature aging, and increases the risk of melanoma, one of the fastest-growing cancers in young people. Doctors urge everyone, especially youth, to protect their skin, wear sun-protective clothing, use sunscreen, and avoid intentional burns. And now for some good news. A breakthrough from Harvard scientists suggests that a metal commonly used to treat bipolar disorder may help reverse Alzheimer's disease, at least in mice. After 7 years of research, scientists found that small amounts of lithium orotate restored memory and brain function in aging mice, clearing harmful protein plaques that are hallmarks of the disease. Published in the journal Nature, the study reveals that lithium plays a key role in maintaining healthy brain connections, insulating nerve fibers, and helping brain cells clear out toxic buildup. As humans age, natural lithium levels in the brain drop, potentially triggering the damage seen in Alzheimer's. Researchers emphasize this is not a call to take lithium supplements, as human trials are still needed. But because lithium orotate is inexpensive and used in very low doses, experts are calling for fast-track clinical studies. If confirmed, this could lead to a game-changing new approach to detect, treat, and even prevent Alzheimer's, a disease currently affecting more than 7 million Americans. And those are your weekly health headlines.
Welcome back to What's Health Got to Do with It? I'm Dr. Joe Sirven, and from the hidden dangers of stroke to stories from the frontiers of neuroscience, we now explore the brain's hidden wonders, unlocking its secrets, revealing how the most complex organ in the universe inspires us all. Let's meet Maria. Maria Santos is a 45-year-old architect who suffered a left hemisphere stroke affecting her language centers. Previously monolingual, meaning she speaks only one language in English, she lost her ability to speak for 3 weeks. When the speech returned, she spoke fluent Portuguese, a language she'd never learned. Her husband, born in Brazil, was astounded as Maria conversed effortlessly about childhood memories he'd never heard before. What neurological phenomenon explains Maria's sudden acquisition of Portuguese? This extraordinary case represents acquired foreign language syndrome, a rare variant of a foreign accent syndrome. When Maria's stroke damaged her dominant language centers, her brain likely activated dormant neural pathways containing traces of Portuguese exposure, perhaps from her husband's conversations, media, or unconscious linguistic absorption over years of marriage. This remarkable case demonstrates how brain injury can sometimes unlock hidden capabilities rather than simply causing deficits. The brain's ability to reorganize and reveal dormant linguistic memories showcases the incredible adaptability of our neural networks. In her new book, The Mind Electric, a neurologist on the strangeness and wonder of our brains, neurologist Dr. Priya Anand takes us on a fascinating journey through the brain's wonders and vulnerabilities, weaving together cutting-edge science, poignant patient stories, and her own experiences at the front lines of neurology. She joins us today to explore what we know, what we don't, and why understanding the brain may be the key to understanding ourselves. Dr. Anand, welcome to our program.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that beautiful introduction and that fascinating case.
You bet. Well, you have so many fantastic cases in your book that I'm excited to share this with our listeners today. Let's dive right into this. You open your book with some truly extraordinary cases. A girl who believes she's been struck blind for stealing a kiss. A mom who thinks her kids have been replaced by changelings. And I'm wondering, what drew you to start the book with these seemingly impossible stories?
You know, I think when we talk about sort of illness, I think there's this risk of feeling almost sort of voyeuristic. So we're looking at something that seems strange or unusual and looking at it as something sort of different from ourselves. But I think what's so remarkable about neurology, something that you really revealed in that case that you shared earlier, is that I think in neurology, even the strangest, most unusual or peculiar sounding symptoms have the potential to tell us something about what we all share as human beings. And so, you know, someone who stops recognizing her children as her own, that tells us something about how familiarity lives in our brains and how it helps us to kind of form relationships. For instance, the example that you gave was such a beautiful one, and it speaks to the way that language is one of the most kind of privileged functions in our brains. So I wanted to sort of illustrate with examples, cases, patients that I've cared for, but also stories from my own body, my own family, that tell us something about some of the things, qualities we all share as human beings, whether or not we've experienced neurologic illness.
Dr. Nand, critics are already calling you the heir to Oliver Sacks and comparing your work to his legendary medical tales. So I want to ask, how does it feel to be mentioned alongside such an iconic neurologist writer? And then the B part of this is, why do you think neurology style stories really become so memorable to folks who are interested in the literary world?
So I'll start by saying that I think Oliver Sacks is completely singular, and I will never describe myself as in the same sentence as Oliver Sacks or as the heir to Oliver Sacks. I do really love his writing. I think, again, I think it's totally unique. Two of the things I love the most about Oliver Sacks. So one is that when he wrote books like Awakenings, which is his story of people who had survived the encephalitis lethargica epidemic, he writes about how the reason he was able to tell these stories that were interesting to people is because he practiced at a chronic care hospital in New York, a rehabilitation hospital. And he said, this hospital feels to me like sort of parts unknown. So most doctors, let alone most of the public, have never set foot in a hospital like this that cares for older people who have survived things that most people in America were born long after. So he talks about how the place that he practiced really allowed him to share stories that were not on anyone's radar. And then I really love that, especially towards the end of his life, he started to include his own experiences. So his own experiences of delirium at the end of his life. And so I love those two qualities in his writing. I practiced at a very different kind of hospital than he did. I practiced at a safety net hospital where most of my patients were born outside of the United States and come to the US as asylees or refugees. Many of my patients are unhoused or marginally housed or grappling with other kind of other social factors in their world. And so I also feel like I get to witness stories that are really unseen by the rest of medicine and often, other kind of the general public. Even though my context is very, very different from his, I really admire that he sought to share stories that were not kind of in everyone's consciousness. And then I also tried to weave my own experiences into this book and really tried to kind of have some skin in the game, but mine are very different than his. I wrote about my own experience of pregnancy and what a radical transformation that felt like for me, for instance, and stories of childbirth, stories of my family mythologies in India. So I tried to take some of the values that he has in his writing, even though my experiences, I think, are quite different from his. And then your second question, I think, is such a timeless one. Why are people so drawn to neurologic? Why do people who love stories, why are we so drawn to neurologic illness? Something Oliver Sacks quotes from a physician who actually was at Johns Hopkins, where I trained many years ago, William Osler, was that he said that to talk of illness is like an Arabian Nights entertainment. And I think what he means by that is that I think illnesses, just like fables or mythologies, I think neurologic illness, when you strip it down, it tells us something about human beings, about what we value, about how we're constructed. And I think people are really drawn to that because I think our brains are prone to thinking in stories. And I think we apply those stories to illness to kind of find meaning in illness. And I think nowhere more than neurology does illness intersect with our life story as kind of poignantly as in kind of neurologic illness.
Let me follow up on that. So I kind of like frame it. You write about this in the book, and I want to kind of ask it this way: how do the stories our brains tell us and the stories we tell about our brains actually help you, the physician, diagnose and treat neurological conditions?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question, and I think there are so many different layers to sort of how I could answer it. So I think in my neurology training, I was so fascinated by phenomena like confabulation. So you are a neurologist, this is something you've seen, but maybe many of your listeners haven't. Confabulation is this unconscious impulse that our brains have to tell a story, to fill in information that they're missing. So an example is when someone has an illness that causes amnesia. I sometimes see it as a result of a particular kind of vitamin deficiency that causes a severe amnesia. I will sometimes ask a patient, have we met before? And they will have no memory of why they're in the hospital. They'll have no memory that I'm their doctor, but they'll tell me something like, we've met before. We were childhood best friends, or we met at our high school reunion, or I'm sitting here wearing this around my head because I'm about to play in the big football game later. These really detailed, kind of exquisite stories that any novelist would envy. And I was so fascinated by the symptom for the longest time. I thought, that's so strange. What a strange thing about neurologic illness. But I think I've realized that actually those stories really speak to how we move through the world at all times. Like our brains are constantly spinning stories to help us know what to focus on, to help us make sense of our world and find meaning. And I think it can become really kind of clear when someone has a neurologic illness, and story can become part of that illness, but it really speaks to something universal about us as humans. And, I also, again, I practice in a context where I take care of people from all over the world. And I really am fascinated by the stories that people and communities tell to make sense of their own illness. So, and I'll give you just one more example, which is sleep paralysis is something that maybe some of your listeners have experienced because it's shockingly common. Something like 1 in 10 people will experience it. And sleep paralysis is this really strange and scary experience. It happens just as you're falling asleep or waking up at kind of that intersection between wakefulness and sleeping. And essentially what happens is your body is paralyzed, and some of the imagery of dreams will start to kind of invade your waking mind. So
Wow.
You'll see shadowy figures or hear strange sounds. And it's so common that every cultural tradition has a story to explain it. And I could tell you something about the science of sleep paralysis, what's happening in your brainstem or your spinal cord. But if you ever have experienced it, you might tell me that misses the point. That doesn't capture the panic and the strangeness and the otherworldly feeling. But if you look at these cultural myths, every culture has a story about a witch or a sorcerer or a spirit that sits on your chest and traps you in your body.
Yeah.
And I think there's a truth to those stories too. Like they tell you something about that illness that the science can never capture. So I think there's a value in both.
Dr. Nunn, your writing beautifully captures both the science and the humanity of, treating people with brain and nervous system conditions. Could I ask you to perhaps share a passage from your book, The Mind Electric, that you feel reflects the heart of your book, or a moment that still lingers with you?
I would love to. So I think I'm going to read from a chapter that talks a little bit about my experience of medical training and my own sort of induction into the world of neurology.
Okay.
To examine someone is to come to know their nervous system intimately, to dissect each of its component parts: brain, spinal cord, nerves, muscles. At its best, the neurologic exam is an improvised dance. It has a rhythm, a give and take. It is graceful, fluid. The neurologic exam looks different for every examiner. Variations in the words one neurologist used to test language function compared with another, for instance, and for every patient. It can take a minute or an hour, each of its steps comprising innumerable possibilities that can be expanded or contracted like an accordion, depending on the patient, the deficit, the context. At its most basic, in a comatose patient, the exam might mean digging one's knuckles into the thin skin over the chest to see if she wakes, or carefully probing the glistening arches of the palate with a cotton swab to see whether they reflexively spasm. At its most complex, it tests the subjective as well as the objective, interrogating someone's experience of a pinprick, of the cold shock of metal against bare skin, of a vibrating tuning fork pressed against a joint, more forms of sensation than I had ever before imagined, each mapped separately. On call, I learned to probe these nuances of consciousness, language, sensation, while I ran breathless beside a gurney, the pager still shrieking at my waist. I learned on those long calls that even those basic functions of sensation, movement, breath, the ones that slip from synapse to synapse below the surveillance of conscious thought, are fragile. Every plank in the tenuous bridge from mind to body can be broken, if not by a curse, then by a swerving car, a wayward scalpel, simple bad luck, and it was my job to find the breaks. During those shifts, Hour after exhausted hour, I forced my sleep-deprived brain to watch for the waddling gait of failing hip muscles, listen for the hoarse voice of a severed nerve, feel for the spastic catch of a bruised spinal cord, until the particular art of neurologic diagnosis became a part of my bones themselves, as reflexive as a firing synapse. By the end of residency, I was supposed to be able to make a diagnosis in my sleep. Often, I practically did.
Wow. And to all of our listeners out there, you're listening to What's Health Got to Do with It on WJCT News 89.9. I'm Dr. Joe Sirven, and if you're just joining us, we are talking the Mind Electric, a neurologist on the strangeness and wonder of our brains. And we want to hear from you. Tag me on social media at @JServin. Your book also takes us kind of in a travelogue journey from Boston's hospitals to childhood in India to the Caribbean to West Africa. And I'm wondering, how have all of these diverse cultural experiences influence how you think different societies interpret and cope with neurologic symptoms, symptoms related to brain disease or neurological problems?
I think the biggest lesson I've taken from those travels, I think a lot of those journeys started out with me trying to understand sort of difference. And I think what they've really kind of taught me is the ways that we're all the same. We are all confronted, illness is profound no matter where you are or who you are, and our bodies all have the same, are all made up of the same parts no matter where you are. And I think all of us are doing the exact same thing, whether we're doctors or people experiencing illness or watching our loved ones experience illness. We're all trying to make meaning out of this sort of sometimes kind of startling or really profound transformation that we're experiencing. So I think the biggest lesson I've taken is that everywhere people are the same, bodies are the same. We all tell stories about illness. And I love the really kind of specific folklore that exists around illness in different places. But it really kind of, when you trace it back, we're all doing the same thing to try and understand illness, whether we're using the language of a sorcerer's spell or the language of what we can see under a microscope. We're really all kind of telling stories to understand our illness.
You explore what you call the compelling paradox at the heart of neurosciences, which is that the strangest symptoms experienced by a single person can tell us or show us something universal about being human. Can you give us an example of that? How one of these bizarre neurosymptoms illuminates something fundamental about how our brains work?
So the example that I love is really related to the case that you started out this conversation with, which is the example of language. And so much of what we understand about language, how it lives in the brain, how our brain privileges language above so many other functions, comes from seeing people who have experienced strokes or brain injuries that rob them of their language. So we understand how the fact that we can produce language and the fact that we can understand language, those lived in distinct parts of our brains. And we know that because we've seen people who have injured one or the other, but still been able to either understand or kind of to speak. And I find that so, I think if there's that kind of tracing the story of language and how we've come to understand language over our history, I think really speaks to how much we rely on these injuries to help us to reveal something universal about our brains. And I'll share just one more example, which is a personal one, which is something that I started to understand about illness and bodies and everyone's illness and bodies from my own family. My grandfather grew up in rural India and had polio as a child. And then when I was a medical student, he developed this very strange sort of wasting illness. He started to lose weight. He lost his muscles. He stopped being able to speak. And I went with him to the neurologist, and we discovered that he had what's called a post-polio syndrome. So even though he had healed from his childhood infection, the echo of that infection still kind of lived on in his body and still affected his muscles and sort of reawakened later in his life. And that's a very, in the 21st century, I think, unless you live in certain parts of the world, that's a really unusual thing to witness or experience. It's a really strange illness. It's a disease that much of the world has sort of forgotten about, but it really speaks to the fact that our stories and our histories are written into our bodies and into our brains, and we carry them with us always. And I think that's something that's so universal to all of us.
In our last moments together, what do you hope readers will take away or maybe change their perceptions about their own brains, mental health, or neuro conditions that affect so many millions of people worldwide? What's that hope and goal, if you wish, for those who read the book?
I think a couple of things that I hope people take from this. So I shared with you before we started taping that I was the most nervous for neurologists to read the book because I wanted to make sure I didn't let anyone down in my accuracy. But it's really a book that's written for everyone. So it includes kind of medical history, but it also includes poetry, fables, mythologies, my own stories, memoir, in a way. And the goal is to sort of get at illness and to get at neurological illness in particular from all different sides and all different angles. So all of the different language and tools that we can use to understand illness and to sort of find meaning in our bodies, I try to kind of explore in the book. So I hope that no matter which of those modalities resonates with you, I hope that you find a voice in the book that really speaks to you and helps you to understand illness more completely.
Dr. Nunn, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. This conversation has been delightful. The book, just a masterpiece. I just wish you the best of success as it goes out, and I hope everyone gets a chance to read it because it truly is something special.
Thank you so much for reading and for having me on your program and for everything that you do to make our bodies more legible to the big audience who's listening to you.
We really appreciate it. We have been talking with Dr. Priya Anand. She is the author of the exceptional book, The Mind Electric, a neurologist on the strangeness and wonder of our brains. Well, that's our program for today. We hope you've enjoyed our show. If you missed anything, you can listen to the full episode at wjct.org and on your favorite podcast app. Thanks to all of our guests. Our executive producer is David Luckin. Stacey Bennett is our producer. Brady Corum is our director. Caden Collins is our researcher. If you have questions about this or any topic, let us know by calling us at 904-358-6362. Email us at health@wjct.org or tag me on social media at jsirven. I'm Dr. Joe Sirven, and you're listening to What's Health Got to Do With It on WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Thank you for listening, and stay in touch.
Support for What's Health Got to Do With It is provided in part by the American Brain Foundation invests in research across the spectrum of the brain, knowing all brain diseases, disorders, and injuries are connected. There can be no cures without research. Learn how you can make a difference today at AmericanBrainFoundation.org. Rethreaded needs you to make a difference in the lives of human trafficking survivors. Learn more about supportive services and an array of survivor-made products at rethreaded.com. And by Neurelis, a leading neuroscience company focused on the development and commercialization of therapeutics for the treatment of epilepsy and other neurologic disorders. The company's unique drug portfolios strive to address unmet needs in patient care. Learn more at Neurelis.com.